Hi there, everyone, and good evening. Thank you for tuning into our discussion this evening. We're very excited to have a fantastic conversation about climate change and climate action in Afghanistan. I'm delighted this evening to be joined by Andrew Scanlon, who is a technical environment expert and has previously the Afghanistan country project manager for the UN Environment Project. He's worked on a wealth of projects in Central Asia that, among many things, have promoted the sustainable management of large landscape systems. I'm also joined by Simon Addison, so in his role as principal researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development, leads on design and implementation of research and policy work that furthers equitable and climate resilient development. We're also joined by Rohina Kabir, who is a master's student in interdisciplinary studies at York University, who is currently working with the UN and the South Asia Regional Cooperation to present research and recommendations on Afghanistan's environmental laws. And also by Mohammed Salimi. He's an electrical engineer and energy management and policy expert who's worked on key power transmission projects and is also the co-founder and exchange manager of IAESTE Afghanistan, and has been playing a pivotal role in sending Afghan students abroad on STEM internships. So if we kick things off this evening with Simon, please could you tell us a little bit about the IIED and what the organisation kind of seeks to achieve in terms of a more equitable, climate resilient and development solutions? Oh, you're on mute, Simon. Sorry.
Typical. Thanks very much, Kate. So the International Institute for Environment and Development's quite a long-running think tank now. We were set up in the 70s to really focus on picking apart that relationship between environment and its impacts on sustainable development in the global south in developing countries, with a particular focus on the development challenges of the poorest and most marginalized communities in the global south, and how their challenges, their poverty, their vulnerability to disasters is very much linked to the way environmental questions have been addressed and the way that their access to and control over natural resources has been structured through colonialism and then development processes over the past 100 years or so. The work that we do in the climate change group is very much based on that tradition within the Institute. And our focus is on trying to identify solutions to the climate risks that the poorest and most vulnerable communities in the global south face, with a particular focus on the issues around governance and access to resources that those communities face. So we put a lot of emphasis on looking at the impediments to participation in decision-making by poor and vulnerable communities, particularly women as a particular vulnerable group, and work with institutions from the international level to the national and to the local level to work out ways that those who are most vulnerable to climate change and to the disaster risks associated with climate change can have their voice heard, so that they can then access the resources they need to implement actions that are relevant to their context and their needs and their priorities.
Yeah, great. So clearly, I mean, you've touched on here a little bit. What we're seeing is different countries across the world are disproportionately being affected by the climate crisis. But we're also seeing sort of further inequity in terms of different groups and communities. Could you talk a little bit more on that and the kind of the different experiences and how there's disparity between different community groups within vulnerable countries?
Sure. So climate, vulnerability to climate is very much related to vulnerability to other kinds of problems. It is really a function of the access that people have to a range of different resources and capabilities. So in particular, access to income or to material resources that can help you overcome challenges in your daily life or in your life, your livelihood, your your career or whatever it might be is fundamental. If you're poor and you don't have access to those resources, it's very hard to plan from day to day, from year to year, to respond to new challenges as they arise. So globally, we see that it's the poorest people in the world that are most vulnerable to the changes that are happening in the global climate. So there's a justice element there in terms of who has access to the resources that are needed to adapt to and to become more resilient to the challenges that are posed by climate change. There's also a kind of justice element to this geographically, in that if we look at how climate change has evolved over the past few hundred years, it is the rich countries of the global north that, and not just the rich countries, but also the emerging, the rich elites of formerly colonized countries that through their consumption patterns have contributed most to the climate crisis. So the climate emergency globally has been driven by those who are least affected by it, or least vulnerable to it, whereas those who have contributed the least are the most vulnerable. So there's a very significant injustice geographically between those who have caused this problem and those who are already being affected and who will be affected most in the future. There's also an important aspect of intergenerational equity and justice that is becoming very important, in that it's young people that are going to be most affected by the consumption of those who have preceded them. It's particularly pertinent to many developing countries such as Afghanistan, where you've got a very, very significant youth population. I think that it's around 50% of Afghanistan's population is under the age of 15.
Mm-hmm.
Very similar population dynamics in other fragile states or countries affected by chronic conflicts who are highly vulnerable to climate change, like Somalia, where poverty and a lack of opportunity for young people is affecting them very seriously now. And as climate change gathers steam, as it erodes opportunities that might be available to them if adaptation doesn't happen, may simply drive people to take what we sometimes refer to as negative coping strategies, like responding to the calls of extremist groups to enter insurgency movements, those kinds of things, to exercise their grievances and try and find alternative opportunities in those kinds of ways. So if climate change is not addressed in a inclusive way that can take the multiplicity of vulnerabilities, whether it's the poorest people, ethnic minorities, women and children, or young men who find themselves without an understanding of what their future might be, then if all those injustices are not addressed as a whole, taking a kind of integrated and holistic approach, then it probably won't be addressed very successfully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fantastic. And sort of coming off that, I guess, looking at the broader kind of global picture, it would be good to hear from you, Andrew, on kind of the projects you've been working on kind of historically and the kind of key challenges you've seen people in the country, in Afghanistan, face as a result of this, these increasingly frequent natural disasters. So could you speak on that a little?
Sure. And the climate story in Afghanistan for me has been my experience with the UN program and the national government, beginning with Hamid Karzai, who brought Afghanistan into the institutional framework through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, 2004, when he signed up to it on behalf of the people. And then assisted, at that time there was no environment law. Environment law came into place 2006-07, and then the National Environmental Protection Agency was set up. So these are institutional aspects that are actually quite critical in the country, coming up to the government of Ashraf Ghani, who then signed on behalf of the people of Afghanistan the Paris Agreement in 2015. That institutional. Those are high-level documents. Those are national and international plans. And Afghanistan has done surprisingly well. For a country that's physically, they say that the 14th most vulnerable country to climate change in the world, first or second most vulnerable in Asia. Bangladesh is particularly vulnerable as well because of its geography. Afghanistan, physically, scientifically, particularly vulnerable because of its geography. But that's also what makes Afghanistan such a wonderful and such a great country as well, is its location. So it's a real challenge. The background, it's a fragile state, is critical. So the country of Afghanistan, the institutions, the people, and the physical geography being particularly difficult doesn't make it easy. But it's also struggling with its politics, struggling with peace building programs, and building a great new economy, and building a great new country. Coming from 2001 up to today, it's less than 20 years. So how far Afghanistan has come as a fragile country and building its future itself has been a great progress. And what Afghanistan in that context has done on climate action, we always like to use that phrase in Afghanistan, climate action, is really astounding. And I just would really highlight the national document that can be referenced is the nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, which Afghanistan has prepared. It's done more and above what could possibly be done for a country in such a difficult situation. And I know that it led the least developed countries group in the Paris negotiations with Prince Mustafa Zahir and with Ashraf Ghani at that time. The science, I think Simon can speak a lot to that. And in Afghanistan, professors in geosciences and environmental sciences in Afghan national universities can speak to the science very well. It's a difficult situation physically. Science tells us it's, but the country politically has done everything that it possibly can do institutionally to at least to be ready to respond. The third part of the puzzle is the people. And again, Afghanistan is it's a big country the size of France. It has differences in elevation of over 6 kilometers from the highest point to the lowest point. And how that country actually responds is very different compared to the borders with Iran, the Sistan Basin, to the highest mountains in the Wakhan corridor. And there's so many different responses needed. And the people are going to lead that, not the government, not the scientists in the universities, and not the excellent Afghan talent, the engineers, the scientists, and the managers that are helping to run the country. But the people of Afghanistan are still the action holders. So to what extent that nationally determined plan for climate action in Afghanistan to respond, and most importantly for Afghanistan to adapt to climate change, not so much to mitigate climate change. That is the more than 50% of the national plan on climate that adapt to the changing climate. And again, really amazing credit to the Afghan people, the Afghan government, and the Afghan experts for what they've done to date. That's first overview there.
Fantastic, thank you. That was very comprehensive. Could you kind of also talk a little bit more on some of the kind of incidents and events that have been particularly challenging in the last few years, maybe such as the 2018 drought, in terms of, to kind of highlight the need for this action to be driven by the people and the institutions, but by the people. Could you kind of talk on the severity of incidents that have been occurring in the last few years, and kind of what that represents in terms of the future if things aren't to change?
The let's call them climate conditions in the last not just in the last 20 years, but over the last 50 to 60 years, we are seeing increasing drought in the country and increasing aridity. But Afghanistan has been a tough place with tough people. So with the 360 odd districts in the country, that's where the response will be. And to some extent, the aridity and drought that we're experiencing is not something particularly new. But what we do see in terms of the national level is the lack of storage of water, for example, which makes drought particularly hazardous at the district level. We see in higher mountain regions, and this is very new. So to some extent, it's just anecdotal evidence, but that the communities that are living in the higher mountain areas of the country are moving down towards the towns. Now, to what extent that's social factors and economic factors versus environmental factors, we don't really have the deep social and environmental science studies and the interviews and the experiences from the field to say what's the drivers there and what are the effects. But certainly there is a movement of urbanization in the country, but as I say, that can be because of the particularly complicated situation in Afghanistan. It's many factors there.
Makes sense, yeah. So moving on to Rohina, can you please tell us a little bit about the work kind of coming off this point in terms of how well Afghanistan's been doing in terms of its subscription to various laws and things like the Paris Agreement? Could you talk to us a little bit about the work you're doing to kind of research Afghanistan's environmental laws with the SARC?
Of course. Thank you, Kate. Thank you for having me and for such an important discussion. And thank you for all the work that Afghanaid is doing. So for the work that I'm doing is part of the Kathmandu University in Nepal. So that university has been chosen as part of the Millennium Fellows, which is part of the United Nations Academic Impact. Millennium Fellows are usually university undergraduates selected based on their leadership on sustainable development, related projects that advance the SDGs in their communities. In our research, we're looking at regional level. The project that we're leading, I could give you a little detail since we are still working on the project we have on our research and the underlying purpose. So the aim of this project is to look at the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SARC. The SARC countries, which consist of 8 member states, which one of them is Afghanistan. I'm the lead researcher for Afghanistan, and there's Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And the SARC headquarters is located in Kathmandu, Nepal as well. So we're looking into South Asian countries' climate change legislation and implementation of those legal instruments and doing a comparative analysis of those legal instruments. So as Andrew had mentioned, we are taking those and comparing those with the international standards, so the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So I am the research lead for Afghanistan, and every team has their own research lead. So right now, Afghanistan is focusing on the National Environmental Protection Agency, the NEPA, that was established in 2005 with the help of United Nations Environment Programme. Currently, we are dissecting laws, regulations, policies, and strategies of NEPA. And once we're done, we're going to be doing a comparative analysis and providing those recommendations to SARC.
Fab. So what, at this point in terms of in your research, what kind of is emerging as what a kind of successful regional cooperation with SARC would look like? What's kind of emerging there?
Yeah, so it's important to mention that Afghanistan is predominantly an agrarian-dependent country that has farmers and herders. Approximately 80% of the population relies directly on the country's environmental resources to meet its daily needs. and according to the Constitution, Article 15 of the Afghanistan's Constitution, it states that the state shall be obligated to adopt necessary measures to protect and improve forests as well as the living environment. So there's a lot at stake. First being that with the inter-Afghan peace talks, the Constitution in itself is is on the table to be amended. So that's that. Although we're very optimistic trying to configure and provide recommendation to SARCs, of course, we have not delved into the recommendation as of yet. It's very early on in the research, but hopefully when we do, we want to provide national and international recommendation to put forward. We have highlighted that Afghanistan's stability and peace heavily relies on the regional cooperation.
Amazing, yeah. So kind of coming off that and looking at the flip side from the kind of institutional, national and international kind of frameworks we're looking at there, could you talk a little on what climate activism and climate action kind of looks like in the grassroots of Afghanistan? You know, as we touched upon earlier, there's a really, really young population of Afghanistan. What's that kind of looking at in the grassroots?
Yeah, of course. So we see that a lot of younger generation is moving towards and studying and specializing in the area of climate change. And one thing has to be noted that Afghanistan, there's a high percentage of poverty rate. And sometimes individuals have to decide between making a living and between activism as well. So that is something that the dichotomy that they're stuck in between. So right now, the Afghan youth are helping shape the country's first national environmental policy with the help of environmental program, United Nations, for NEPA. Of course, climate change activism in a country like Afghanistan is not easy, especially when you're making a living in the activism. I remember, so for example, there were individuals who did a lot of activism. When we reached out to them after a couple of years, they were like, "No, we couldn't proceed with that kind of work anymore because we had to choose another way that was affordable and ways of making our ends meet." So that's a sad reality of Afghanistan, but that's a really realistic example.
Yeah, completely. And kind of coming off that, in terms of from an education perspective, what kind of education is there on the subject of climate change in Afghan schools? Are kind of schools confronting these kind of topics? Is that how people who you mentioned there, who obviously, dichotomy aside in terms of wanting to be involved in activism and not necessarily having the means, but is it coming from schools, the kind of awareness, or is it from other kind of frameworks?
Certainly other frameworks, I would say. There is awareness coming from, so in terms of the curriculum, Afghan schools, girls' education, they do have geography courses, but there's no curriculum set aside for climate change course in itself. So there is, so in geography courses, they tend to teach very briefly on the subject, but and that too in Kabul municipality, not rural areas, not so much. But with the information that I have in Kabul municipality, it's from geography classes, that in itself is a problem, because we need to have the education there for people to understand that climate change, and we need to create a plan to move forward, and that unfortunately is not there.
Okay, Thank you so much. Kind of coming off this, it would be great, Javi, to kind of hear on the topic of education about your work through IAESTE in Afghanistan, and how you help students and young professionals into STEM internships and get technical experience abroad. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Hello, everyone. I'm glad we are having this discussion on climate change. I think we really feel the need for such discussions, so that the first thing we can do about is do the public awareness, like let people know what's happening to them, why their rivers are drying, why we have like seeing more warmer days. Like that would be the first step. And then the second step would be to build the resilience. Like this is something beyond our control, I guess. So building the resilience would be the second thing. And that's what we have been doing through IAESTE. IAESTE stands for International Association for Exchange of Students for Technical Experience. Actually, it was founded for the first time in 1946 in Imperial College London, and since then they have exchanged more than 400,000 students across like more than 100 countries. And we joined in 2016 for the same purpose. Our first priority was the high unemployment rates that were skyrocketing at that time, and we needed like just a group of students. We came together and we wanted to do something about it. It was a small start, but we made it through. And the second part that was actually in my head was about the climate change and studies related to climate change in Afghanistan. In the curriculum, as Rohina mentioned, in high schools and primary education, we don't have anything for students. Like if we look at the bigger picture and the movements, like what the Greta Thunberg started, that was from the school, and she saw something. She was influenced by something. And then she started that movement. It is now the biggest climate-related movement in the world. And high school student actually started it. But we don't have such things in Afghanistan, especially in the education system. And also in the universities, like the only energy-related program I know is in Kabul University. That program was also started when I was graduating in 2015. It was actually started a year ago in 2040, Renewable Energy Department of Kabul University, and now they are graduating students. In electrical engineering, yes, that's also, we touched those parts, but if you do not study by yourself, go after this, there is nothing for you in the curriculum. You won't see anything. So through IAESTE, we actually wanted to exchange students with other countries in engineering related to fields. And my focus was more on energy systems, how like sustainable electrical systems, climate change, so that we can train students through this in other countries and then bring them back to Afghanistan. Or it's actually a one-by-one exchange, but the situation back home in Afghanistan was really bad, that we couldn't really bring in students from other countries where they had the expertise and education in these fields. But yeah, our goal at that point was to send out students and have them have internships in climate-related energy, clean energy, and other fields that we do not have in Afghanistan. And we do feel we have the need for them. And that's what we were doing through IAESTE, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for telling us about that. So it would be great now if I could go back to Andrew, just to sort of talk through a little bit for kind of our audience members who maybe aren't as aware. Could you tell us a little bit about what sustainable resource management is and what kind of at the community level, a successful form of resource management that's sustainable would look like?
Sure, and again, I know it's difficult in Afghanistan, but we have to complement Afghanistan. And when it comes to sustainable community level management, we see in mountain villages especially, but in the highlands too, not only in the mountain valleys, but the valleys and the villages and the mountain areas of Afghanistan, we see hundreds of years of experience, really good experience in sustainable natural resource management. The knowledge is there. To some extent, since the 80s and 90s, it's been lost through some of the international interventions. Maybe naively, not negatively minded, but that's been the result, where we have, for example, large-scale agriculture going on now in the Central Highlands, with at one point hundreds of tractors coming in and digging down up to 40, 50 centimeters into the topsoil, where previously sustainable ploughing with animals had been done. And in the mountain valleys, you have to be very careful when you plough. So that was sustainable natural resource, sustainable agriculture in mountain valleys in Afghanistan. Hundreds and hundreds of experience. The same in terms of knowledge about seeds. Afghanistan, the home of some of the Neolithic crops, Neolithic founder crops, which are used by humans going back up to 7,000 years, farmed, and to some extent in places like Badakhshan and Takhar, still farmed. Same Neolithic crops still being farmed 7,000 years without break, and the seeds being exchanged every year for that amount of time. But when we talk about sustainability, we can learn so much from Afghanistan as well. That's just a comment. In terms of challenges, then, well, it's with the population growth, with the conflict situation, with climate changing, putting pressure on these traditional systems, we can learn from science and from engineering and from agriculture and from government systems how to support traditional ways of being. Whether that's water management, you go to places like Daikundi, where the water was moved in the Kariz system down as far as Herat, but moved in the ground up to 10 or 15 feet below the ground. These are traditional ways of moving water around. But then with climate change, that's no longer working. So we need to start on trying to understand sustainable irrigation systems, storage of water. I mentioned that before. It's a really great opportunity for the country. Storage and transmission of water in smaller systems. And then ultimately for Afghanistan, it's really about the topography and each of the regions, not so much the provinces. The provinces don't always follow geographic and topographic landscape, but the river basins and the watersheds of the country are a very good way to think about how sustainability in natural resources is possible. And I know, again, Afghanistan is through the Ministry of Energy and Water, with the support of the Environment Agency, and even through the President's Office as well, trying to think about the country in terms of its topography, in terms of its watershed, river basins, is a very good macro approach to sustainability that we do see in the country. And that's how the local projects then and the local actors, including local government, can respond.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of that, could you talk a little bit more on how those kind of sustainable resource management techniques can also kind of help with disaster risk reduction? So looking at things like watershed management and things like terracing, could you speak a little bit more on that and how it can help kind of reduce the levels of floods and reduce avalanches and kind of disasters that we're seeing more frequently? Can you talk a little bit about the techniques that kind of regional and various NGOs can kind of implement in order to help these communities?
Yeah, you mentioned terracing, and that's a great example. It works, especially micro level catchment management and reducing the runoff of precipitation, water, snow, ice, and running and moving the soil out of activity into down the valleys. So terracing works, micro-terracing, planting trees, not just foreign trees, but native species of trees that have been growing in the country for thousands and thousands of years, millions of years in some cases. And then trying to understand better the local species that you use in your climate action projects. And having species lists that experts from abroad, but mainly from Afghanistan, experts in botany, experts in silviculture and forestry, to encourage the use of Afghan species in restoration programs. And there is incredible resources in the country and incredible knowledge in the country, going back certainly to through the time of the university system. Kabul University, I think, is 84 years old now, 85 years old. And there's a lot of knowledge there in that system. So the use of native species is a really big opportunity adapted to climate change.
Fab, thank you. And now moving a little bit more on to look at this through a sort of gender lens. Simon, could you talk a little bit, we know that globally women comprise kind of 40% of the agricultural workforce, yet, as you mentioned earlier, there's often, unequal access to land, water, energy, various resources and sort of other services. Could you talk a little bit about how climate change has been kind of emphasizing and exacerbating these inequalities that kind of exist anyway?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, like I said before, the way that climate change impacts depends very much upon the existing, the lay of the land in terms of inequalities. So where inequality exists, when climate change happens, it tends to exacerbate those. And those who are most vulnerable tend to be those who are most affected by inequality at the moment. So across the world, we generally see that it is women and children, broadly speaking, who are worst affected by the impacts of climate change, particularly in very poor and highly exposed communities.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, women tend to be much more badly affected in terms of the health impacts, or even death in the event of natural and human-made disasters. Mm-hmm. In Afghanistan, the data shows that natural disasters kill almost twice as many women as it kills men. Now, the reasons for that vulnerability of women and girls are complex, but they really stem from the different social roles that women and men play in society, and the way that women's role in the household and in the community is structured by social, cultural, and economic norms. And it's those that need to be addressed in order to help women to become more resilient to the shocks that they might face, whether it's droughts or floods, or to contribute to and benefit from any climate action that might happen at the local level. There's a whole host of challenges that need to be addressed, and there are questions of the unequal power relations that women enjoy in terms of particularly their participation in decision making around the things that affect their lives, either individually or as a group. A big problem or challenge to overcome is the access to information that women have. So education, that we've already discussed quite a lot, is really critical for helping women to overcome the vulnerabilities that they face. Particularly, there's two aspects that are really important in Afghanistan as well as in other countries. One is understanding the hazards and the risks that they face as a result of those hazards. So the fact that the questions that Yaweed was pointing to, the fact that rainfall is decreasing, the fact that temperatures are rising, the fact that what is it that's causing these challenges, as well as drawing on their own understanding of how their lives have been affected. Often the knowledge that women hold in themselves based upon their own experience and the experience of their households and communities over generations is also not tapped. So there's a kind of dual challenge there, that the technical information that women might be able to use in order to help them and their families to become more resilient is often not available to them, but equally the deep well of wisdom that they have based on their engagement in agriculture and other forms of livelihood are also not drawn into the decision making of formal institutions or NGOs or others that are working on these issues.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen it in other places where that actually education, women's education, and what we sometimes talk about in terms of empowering women, essentially what that means is helping women to play a stronger role in decision making, but importantly to have a level of control over resources in the household and in the community. And that could be, it could be land. Land is often very important in terms of improving women's access to and ownership and control over land, but also control over decision making in agriculture, so that it serves the needs of the family and not just the male head of the household. In many circumstances, the man decides what will be planted when, so that he can go to the market to get the best price, rather than thinking about the food security of the household as a whole, and particularly of the children. So those kinds of decision-making processes. Equally, helping women to have some access to or control over the revenue that comes from selling food in the market, selling animals in the market, can be transformational. In communities I've worked in Africa, where women have been enabled to have ownership even of small animals like goats, to then have access to the income that they get from selling those goats in the market, using that money either to invest in business, to expand their herd, or to improve the productivity of their farm, can be transformational for a household. So putting women in charge of decision making for the things that concern them is really important. But this is not to say that that's all about that means working with women and just supporting women to do things on their own. It means working with men and women together. It means working with households. It means working with communities to understand the challenges that women face and to come up with solutions together in an integrated way. Particularly challenging, social and cultural norms. They're deeply entrenched over many, many generations that can have these sometimes unintended consequences around women's position and their vulnerability, can be challenging to address. But at the same time, I think we've seen in development work over the past 10, 15 years, an increasing understanding that men aren't just idle layabouts who don't think about other people. They want to and feel a very strong social, familial and social responsibility to protect and to support women and children. Mm-hmm. But often that needs to be facilitated in a positive way, and doing so can have really transformational effects as well for women, in terms of helping them overcome the challenges that they face individually, and thereby transforming the status of their households.
Yeah, fantastic. And that kind of leads nicely on to my next question for Rohina, which, it's kind of looking at how well Afghan women are represented in places where international decisions are being made. We talk here about a kind of household decision making and the benefits it can have. How well are Afghan women kind of in the international spaces where climate change decisions are being made, and can it be improved?
Thank you, Kate. So I do come from a political science background. So something that we use is GPS to evaluate. This is normally used for cabinet, evaluating cabinets, ministries, parliaments, and finding out the gender score of the cabinet. So GPS stands for Gender Power Score. So for the viewers who don't know, how we evaluate or how we get the score is, each ministry is gendered. We gender each ministry. So typically, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we would label it as masculine, and Ministry of Culture, feminine. So typically, the Ministry of Environment, Afghanistan doesn't have that. It would normally fall under a feminine category, just because of the characteristics attached to it. When we're evaluating a NEPA, we have to see that the current and the previous directors were both males, and this shows that even the positions that were typically given to are for women are taken over by men, right? So if climate change badly affects women, and the spaces that for the decision-making spaces, they're even taken over by men, and there's no space. As Simon, I want to echo Simon's point that coming up with a solution together, and it's not just take over by females and run this, be a whole an agency with only females, but work alongside with each other and make sure that and I strongly believe with that someone should take the seat that's valued or is passionate about it, and it's going to make a change, and not just anyone.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of leveraging the benefits of having women within the rooms talking about it, but obviously, as we've discussed, kind of working together as a collaborative approach. Exactly. So moving back to Javid, could you tell us a little bit about your experience, kind of moving more onto sustainable power and things like that now? Could you tell us about your experience with the power transmission project that you were involved in that sought to electrify southeastern parts of Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think this is an important discussion because we know in almost every country, energy is the first industry that has the largest emissions in terms of climate change, and only transportation coming second, and food and agriculture then third and fourth. It varies in that order. But yeah, energy, I think transmission line, especially in Afghanistan, is an important, it is as important as the backbone in a human body. So the grid, it should be, and the purpose it serves is it connects the major centers to the major generation centers. And that's what we did in NIPS 4 to electrify Khost, Kunar. But the question comes that are they really electrified today? But yes, they are connected to the national grid. And these projects, for example, the project I was working with, NIPS 4, it was funded by U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, by Department of Defense of the U.S. And it was a $120 million project, only electrifying Khost and another district in Paktia province. The question is that, okay, Khost is a major load center, and probably there are a few million people there, and it makes sense to connect them to the grid. But when coming to provinces like Nuristan or Panjshir or Kunar, where the terrain is very hard, in Khost it was also very hard, and we had like lots of problems with landmines and cutting down trees and everything, to make the right of way for the transmission line. But the question, for example, with Nuristan or Panjshir with a population of around 300,000 people, if you make a microgrid for them, for example, instead of investing, for example, 100 million on a transmission project to connect them to the national grid, which is not so resilient as we know, But if you like spend that money and make exploit their natural resources that they have there, like solar or wind or hydro as well, like which usually these provinces have, like Panjshir, Kunar, and Nuristan, they are like very small load centers. And if you spend all of that money on transmission line, like you face a lot of problems. Like one would be like the natural disasters, avalanches in winters, and also attacks from militants and all those things. So the overall, like the services will not be as great, and the amount of money you spend on that will like hundreds of millions of dollars on something that doesn't even make sense at the end of the day. But if you spend that, take that money, and like especially for these smaller remote areas, like it doesn't make sense that you know like as we look at our body, our backbone is not like connected to every part. It is just connected to the main part. Like so the same could be done with the grid in Afghanistan, especially in a mountainous and remote areas where you know the connection to the grid is very costly. You know, take that money, like $100 million or like smaller amount of money, just build a microgrid for them, renewable energy sources that's way more resilient in so many different ways, and connect them to that. You know, at the same time, for that, this will also help with the overall demand and supply gap that we have at the moment in Afghanistan. Because like if you connect them to the national grid, like all of these load centers, at the end of the day, what you will have is a very huge difference between the peak and like what you can provide for them. And that's what we are seeing today. And also the utility and the government, they are heavily relying on importing the electricity needed for this national grid to operate resiliently. And they are importing all of that electricity from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. And in those countries, their generation is mainly from hydro. And the problem with hydro is, okay, it's a renewable source, is good like for the whole region, but it has the highest vulnerability actually to climate change. And we are seeing that. Like, why don't we have electricity in Kabul these days? Because the river flows in winter is decreasing, and that's like our highest peaks are in winter. So because of heating. So the problem, like the overall planning, what actually I think the government is making a mistake in this is they're connecting all these load centers to the national grid. And once you're connected to the national grid, like for example, when I grew up, we used all these sustainable resource management, what Andrew mentioned. Like we had for heating, like, you know, using very little resources, but staying warm in winter. Like there were like so many conventional or very sustainable ways we used to. But once you're connected to the grid, then you heavily rely on the grid, and you know the overall elasticity increases. And once you don't have, the next day you don't have electricity to heat or cool your house, then you go to all these dirty resources like coal and wood and all gas and different kinds of dirty resources, what people are doing in Kabul. And that's why the whole air quality is very bad in winters in Afghanistan. So overall, yeah, the transmission in Afghanistan, what the government should be planning is invest on transmission lines where it is only needed. But as I know of now, they are even investing on transmission line to Panjshir and Kunar and Nuristan. But why do that? Why not like build microgrids for them that are way more resilient and can also solve the problem of the gap between the supply and demand.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, I'm just looking at the time, and we've got some questions in from kind of some people have emailed in some questions. So I think we'll move on to the Q&A section now, just to get some of those done. So if we start off with Simon, could I ask you to answer this question? It says, what kind of impact is coronavirus having on the global progress of the SDGs and climate resilient development? Sort of how, from the issues we've been talking about, how is the pandemic kind of exacerbating them?
Simply put, it's exacerbating. Well, it's the projections at the moment are that coronavirus is going to put many millions of people back into poverty who had been able to get out of poverty over the past 10, 15 years. And that's going to have a direct material impact on the ability, particularly of the poorest countries, to continue on their journey to achieving the SDGs. And that actually the virus, particularly its impact on economies through lockdowns and restrictions on movement, is actually going to undo about a decade's worth of positive movement towards the achievement of the SDGs. That in its turn is going to have a very serious impact upon the resilience, particularly of the poorest, to climate change and climate shocks, because there is such a close relationship between poverty and vulnerability to climate shocks. This has already been noted in Afghanistan as a particular country where, particularly in relation to food security, that this year they're expecting, well, firstly, that growth in Afghanistan, which has been quite encouraging, about nearly 4% last year, is potentially going to be going negative by the end of 2020 as a result of COVID. And equally, that the impact on food security is going to be impacted because there is an increased demand for food in the market, because people haven't been able to farm as well. Markets have been obstructed. They haven't been able to access the food that they need. But equally, they haven't had the income to buy it. And as supply has gone up, demand has gone up, the supply has gone down because of these impacts on the market flow of food. So we're seeing an increase in food insecurity as a result of coronavirus, and not just in Afghanistan, across South Asia and the rest of the developing world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We've got one here from our live audience. What impact has the conflict, especially the long history of displacement and return, had on climate change adaptation, e.g. through knowledge of traditional farming practices that Andrew described? Andrew, can I perhaps get you to speak on this one?
Yeah, sure. And again, just from my knowledge as a person who spent 10 years and I consider it my second home, and I consider myself a good friend of Afghanistan. I hope that I'm not from Afghanistan, but that Afghanistan has always had that movement.
Sorry, Andrew, I think we lost you.
Are you hearing me now?
There. Could you? Yeah, I'm hearing you better now. Could you just repeat just your last sentence? I think we lost you for a bit.
Yeah, well, I was just getting my main point, so that's probably good that you lost me for a bit with my preamble. I was just saying about how Afghanistan has suffered from loss of traditional knowledge because of conflict, because of, in both positive and negative ways, diaspora. You find Afghans going abroad to study, going abroad to live, refugees, and externally displaced. Certainly a lot of knowledge is lost through that. And we don't really have studies on that across the country, to what extent traditional knowledge of Andean agriculture and like what Javed is talking about, with not so much power lines, but integrated energy management for in rural areas and rural Afghanistan. And it is a concern. But that's not just a problem for Afghanistan. I think traditional knowledge globally is lost.
Mm. Yeah.
That when we talk about the national and the global climate action plan, about in all our countries going back to our traditional knowledge and finding great solutions there too, not only technology.
Thank you. Yeah. We also had another one sent in for Rohina via email, asking what are some of the key challenges you expect to face with SARC with regards to regional cooperation in terms of, with other countries that Afghanistan is working with, in terms of, bringing each other up. What's the kind of challenges you might be expecting to face?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So some of the challenges that we've when working, I think the team is a very we're working great together in terms of teamwork, but in terms of getting the resources, Afghanistan doesn't necessarily, all the laws are not as easily attainable as it is for other countries. It takes a lot more work for us to actually translate the laws and regulations from environmental laws and translate them to English, since this document is in English, and then and comparing it. So as opposed to other countries who have already their documents are in English, and comparing them and going on to the comparison analysis. So in that factor, it is challenging. But with my team, there's 2 individuals, myself included, who can read and write Dari. So the rest of us are doing they're not from Afghanistan. And that kind of shows in itself that how much emphasis it's needed to bring this issue and more light onto this issue of climate change in Afghanistan, and how much of a serious this is.
I'm conscious that we've just gone over time, so I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and for sending some fantastic questions in. Obviously, this live stream was free to attend, but this week is our Big Give Christmas campaign week, during which any donations made to our campaign page will be doubled. All money raised will go towards helping communities we work with in Afghanistan fight the destructive impacts of climate change that we've been discussing, and we bolster resilience of communities and their ecosystems to climate-induced hazards. So if you would like to make a donation, just follow the link below in the description, but it will only count as a match donation if you donate before 12 p.m. on Tuesday, the 8th of December. So thanks again, everyone, for watching, and thank you to our amazing panelists for their contributions today. We hope you enjoyed it and have a lovely evening. Bye.
Thank you for having us.